This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I have a little bit of a reversal. I've done it a few times before. I was emailed by a fellow named Liam Cooper who wants to talk about writing, composition, rhetoric, etc. And so I'm just going to ask him a question or two about himself, and then I'll turn over the rest for 90 minutes or more. Welcome, Liam. You emailed me a week or so ago. All I know about you is that you're a teaching assistant at Idaho
Yeah.
State. You said in Pocatello. So how did you find out about my website or me, and what do you want to interview me about particularly?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name's Liam. I'm a schlubby graduate teaching assistant. I actually live in Oregon. I attend university online. I've got a neurological disorder, but that's a long story. I was trying to rack my brain about where I first came across Cosmoetica. I can't nail it down for sure, but I can tell you that it was probably either YouTubing an obscure author, probably Volman. It might
Uh,
have been Pinchon.
uh,
So what ends up happening, I can already see Dan rolling his eyes, but the point I wanted to make is that there's not a whole lot of discourse about some of these authors. So when you YouTube it, often Cosmoetica comes up, and then when you start watching it, it's a very, I don't know if endearing is the right word. I just appreciate the honesty. I like the style, and then I go through the different playlists, and I'm like, he talks about everything I'm interested in. This is great. I mean, often we disagree on our critical perspectives on some of these authors, but for the most part, I think I'm pretty sympathetic with your general critiques. Then I started looking more at your criticism. I think, not to strawman too much, but I think you're more focused on maybe your poetry. I think a lot of readers really like the novels, particularly Vincenzi brothers. I was drawn to the criticism because, first of all, there's no filter between high and low. You'll do anything, which I really enjoy. But then the prescient insights, in particular, I'm thinking about your criticism review on Herman Hesse's Siddhartha. I thought was excellent on your website, on the blog, not one of the videos, one of the, and then another one of your poems that sticks out in my mind is the poem about the barber shop.
oh yeah,
And I think this
the
might
hairs on the
transfer.
fingers.
Yeah. Uh, First of all, happy Thanksgiving. I don't know if we've located ourselves temporally yet,
Yeah.
but I think the barbershop poem kind of transitions into what I'm interested in, right? Because my master's thesis, in a nutshell, is to use composition as a rhetorical lens for literary criticism. Very pedantic, but my basic intent is that you see people with a feminist reading of Jane Austen, you see people with a Marxist reading of Charles Dickens. Why not a compositional reading of a text that analyzes how the writer writes to see how that speaks to the themes of the text itself? The chosen author, I'll get off my soapbox here, is James Joyce, for me particularly, because there is a wealth of archival material where you can actually go in and trace his writing process, which isn't always the case with writers. So it works as a nice example for my intended purposes.
Hmm.
Why I think the barbershop poem transitions nicely is because James Joyce operationally used the epiphany. That was his major thematic intent. His aesthetics was all built on epiphany, trying to not just capture an epiphanic moment that he may have had, but to actually what's the word? Make it so that the reader experiences that epiphany through the writing itself, which is not an easy thing to do. I think the barbershop poem encapsulates what I think when I think about epiphany. It sets this little stage. You enter the barbershop. You're not quite sure why you're there. Ostensibly, probably going to get a haircut, but you can tell the fact that it's a poem means that something's going to happen. So the reader is primed. Nothing really happens, so the tension builds until finally you see a photograph. And a photograph is a snapshot in time, right? Which is an epiphany. So it all involutes onto itself in a sense, where the photograph captures a universal moment in time that was ostensibly important to the barber, which is why he keeps it. But that object can then open up an epiphany for the reader, i.e., the person getting their haircut. That was my interpretation.
Well, first, let me just say, a lot of times when I get emails or I'll talk to younger writers or younger people, just not being recorded for something like this, but just because they want me to critique their poems or something. One of the things I say is, I'm 59 years old, going to be 60 in a little over 2 months, and I've written so goddamn much. Don't expect me to be able to quote myself or something from stuff that I wrote 23 years ago or something. But I think one of the things when it comes to when I read things from especially MFA type programs, and they'll talk about composition, or they'll talk about rhetoric, or they'll talk about humor, or they'll talk about feminist or Marxist or whatever interpretations of something. You if you're dealing with just the same words, you're using the same language, a lot of that is just, I find, excuse making for trying to propel bad writing into something more relevant than the actual words would do. I think oftentimes the reverse is true, is that oftentimes great writing, I'm not someone who's always art for art's sake, but the art has to stand on its own merit. You can do political art. I mean, I have a almost 2.5 million page book called A Norwegian in the Family, which is about a crime family and whatnot. And you know, when you're doing any kind of art, yes, there are going to be moments. One of my favorite, if you want to call it epiphanic moments, I don't know if you're familiar with the paintings of Andrew Wyeth.
Maybe.
His father, N.C. Wyeth, was a famous illustrator. His son, Jamie Wyeth, is also a famous painter. Have you ever heard of the Helga paintings?
No, I'll look into it.
But you've probably seen the Christina's World, the crippled girl on the hill looking towards a farmhouse in the distance.
Right.
It's one of the top 10, 12 most famous paintings in America,
I
in
see.
the 20th century.
Yeah.
Now, Wyeth, my favorite painting, or one of the paintings that sticks out to me more so even than that far more famous painting, and I don't remember the name of the painting, but it's a painting of, it's like behind a barn, it's like a woodshed, there's a picnic table, there's a deer carcass, or maybe it's a carcass of some other animal hanging off a tree limb, just drying out. You can see the tools and implements, you can see someone has been there recently, but they're not in the painting. And so you're just left there with some animal has been just slaughtered or de-skinned or whatever you want to call it, and the actor in the piece is missing from the frame. And is he coming back? Did he just leave? Why did he leave? You can ask all these questions. And epiphanically, if you want to do that, things are as they are. I've used that line a handful of times, I guess, in poems. It's things are what they are, and in life, you can make of it what you will. I'm not a believer in art of this bullshit that people will say, art isn't meant to give answers; it's meant to ask questions. Fucking bullshit. Herman Melville didn't write fucking Moby Dick because he wanted to leave you asking questions. He knew the answers. Yeah, they may be wrong answers in some instances. Out of 100 possible questions, maybe the answers that you could get from Melville, 92 of them you'd agree with and 8 of them you wouldn't. But he knew the answers, and the art is not about asking the questions, but it's about bringing people to a moment where they can understand something. Whether it's the sea rolling on as it did 5,000 years ago, or whatever it might be. And I think too often there are these formulas. Yes, I'm a believer in general principles, but not in lock hard rules. I think whether we're talking about science and we're talking about things like the Big Bang or whatnot, there are things that you can assume about something, but the more you look, the more you tend to know that you know less than you think, which is
Yeah.
another kind of cliche. And in art, it's more about focusing on these little things. They could be an into a character. For example, I just started a play on it's going to be on Catherine the Great, and my into it was, what if I had a black female character in the modern day just after the Trump Kamala Harris election, and she's got some emotional issues dealing not from race issues but just from herself, and
Mm.
she's drawn to Catherine the Great, and her character is also named Catherine though with a K, and how that might play out. Does she have a fantasy life? And I'm not certain exactly where I'm going with it, but I know I'm on the right track. So it's one of those things. I'm very much a pragmatist. Whatever
Yeah.
works works. If I had written a short story or a poem or a whole stand, I'll give you an example. I ran a thing called the Uptown Poetry Group. You might have heard
Hmm.
me talk about
Hmm.
it years ago in Minneapolis when I lived there. And I once had this poem, this big poem, about 6 or 7 pages, on the Battle of Little Bighorn in Custer. And I'd written it, and it was well written, but something wasn't working. And the most ignorant person at that particular group, a woman who only came once and who was a terrible poet, made an offhanded comment where she said, she said something about time, or said the time sequence was wrong. And I thought to myself, not that she's right, but the reason that the poem flowed very much A to B linearly. And I thought, what if I broke up the poem
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and had Benteen and Custer and the American soldiers, the time is skewed and mix things up, and it became a much better poem. That's one of the things that I think, and I'm gonna get preachy sometimes in this interview, so
Yeah.
be prepared for it. But that's one of the things that people sometimes think there's nothing I can learn from even an idiot.
Exactly right.
But one of the things I find is someone can be wrong 99% of
Hmm.
the time, but if you know that one time when they're not wrong, that's the thing. And so you have to be able to pick out the stuff that's elucidating, even when the would-be elucidator doesn't realize it.
Yeah. I believe the comedian Bill Hader
Mm.
said that in the writer's room, somebody will be like, "Oh, that's not funny. Here's why." And they'll give you some reason. He's like, just ignore the here's why.
Yeah.
Just the fact that it wasn't funny, and then you, with your professional toolkit, then you can rescaffold it or whatever. But and in video games, they'll often, this may not be the case anymore, but back in the day, they would bring in just random friends and family to play test the game before release, not to see if they're having fun, just to make sure, where are you confused in this game? How can we edit this game to make the experience better, etc. Um, and to loop back around a little bit, I full-heartedly agree with your perspective on quote unquote MFA mills. My focusing as a comp red, I don't know, for lack of educator, is on first year composition. I'm teaching first year students writing,
Mm-hmm.
not how to write a poem, not how to write, just how to write, and specifically in what's referred to as writing across the curriculum. When you're a scientist, you need to write a report. So writing is a useful tool that students are taught to use as they need throughout their academic careers. That being said, I wanted to circle back on this idea that for a first year writer, first year freshman level undergrad, there's a lot of apprehension because they don't want to appear as wrong. But the point that you made, I think you made, is that you can learn a lot more from the one time that something is wrong than the 99 times it works.
Yeah.
And to impart to play into this, uh, I'm pretty egalitarian with my media consumption because of what you said. Is you never know what you're going to learn from a shitty poem or a stupid YouTube video essay on a topic that you don't care about, right? Because there's, and then as a creative writer, separating it a little from an academic writer, I think novels and long poems enable the author to somewhat filter all of these experiences into a single unit, which can then convey these condensed or distilled moments to the reader in a certain sense.
So I've often said there's a difference between great art and perfect art. You can have a perfect work of art that accomplishes exactly what it accomplishes, just how you envisioned. I have a poem
Yes.
called Congolium Footfalls. It's a dream poem, but it's just about the experience of a dream. There's nothing particularly deeper. Yes, some people may read into it.
You're right.
I've got great poems where, and especially some of the early great poems I wrote 30 some years ago, where I have one or two things that are borderline cliche that if I went back to write them again, I would remove. But that patina of expertise might lack some of the rawness. So something can be great and be flawed, and that to me
Yeah.
is a better thing. And another
Yeah.
thing that on this same topic is one of the worst ways to learn about something is just to learn from something great or something perfect. A
Yeah.
near great poem can teach you far more than a great poem, and for a very simple reason. Uh, a lot of times people will get blinded and they'll say, I remember one time, 15 years or so ago, a guy was arguing with me about W.B. Yeats. He's above us all. You can't, and I'm going to get the fuck out of here. And,
Yes.
and, but when you have something that's great, it's sometimes intimidating to a very young writer. They'll say,
Yeah.
I'll never be able to twist a phrase like that. I'll never be able to delve into a character, or even just using a punctuation mark in the right place. Uh, but when you see something that's near great, you know that one or two things are off, and it's like having a little rip that you can look inside. It's like drawing back
Mm.
the curtain for the Wizard of Oz and see. Oh, wait a minute. It isn't an all powerful being. It's just
Hmm.
a fucked up little man behind a curtain on an ego trip. You
Yeah.
know, and then you can learn lessons. Well, how did this fucked up little man on an ego trip become the great Wizard of Oz? Where you couldn't do that if you didn't have the curtain to pull back.
Yes. And I think I think I'm going to steal that idea for students
By all
because
means.
thank you. I'm a purloiner of letters, but the point being that gets the thought process going. You see something and you're like, that's not quite right. And then your brain starts going, I would have done XYZ differently, which would have been better because of this. And this weird logic puzzle starts taking place in the mind. And then that experience transfers to the writing itself later. Because you're obviously, I'm not going to go back and re edit whatever Mark Twain novel or whatever, but when you start to write your own works, you remember that experience of your brain going through this litany of different ways that the words could have been arranged in order to find an optimal one.
Let me give you and I just want to make some of these points earlier that you can bring up later as we get a little
Mm.
bit deeper. I once was almost involved with a woman about 25 years ago
Shocking.
who about 6 or 7 years ago I saw online. She'd moved to another
Oh,
country.
dude, that's all. That's always so. Yeah. Okay. Go
She'd
on.
moved to another country,
Yeah.
and she was married or whatnot, and she was plotting out. She was plotting out a novel. She was a poet. She had minor potential, but she's one of these people who would have post-its and she'd have a timeline all over her room, and she's photographing it. And the novel was a lesbian version of Mrs. Ahab from Moby Dick, and it's like not only is the idea ridiculous and probably been
Yeah.
hacked, but plotting this out, that's not the
Oh,
way you're going to write a novel. Having said that, though, the end results are what matter. What
yeah.
works for me, my own personal way of approaching things, is not necessarily going to be yours or 10,000 other people who want to write way. For example, when I've written probably about 12 to 15 short story collections. When I wrote those collections, in order to get a unity to the stories, I would write each draft of each story, 1 to 15 stories or whatever it was, draft
Yeah.
one, draft, and that way you're sort of
Like
like
planting
cross stitching
seeds.
things, and even without knowing that you're doing it, rather than write one story end, one story end, doing it that way, and because that's what you'd call now a little Easter egg for a reader, in that
Yes.
in story 3 has
Yes.
a commonality with story 11 that it wouldn't have
Weird
had.
chaos.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so the end results are what matter. How you get there is less important than getting there correctly. Another point I just want to make too, again, just to get this stuff as it's coming to me, is it's important. It's very important as a writer or any artist to learn the craft,
Yes.
learn it, read the masters, learn it, know who you like or who you think is good, what you want to take from them. But then at some point, if you go through it and you develop your own style, you have to unlearn. You have
Yeah.
to unlearn the stuff so that you can break these rules, because these hard and fast rules that are initially a ladder that helps you climb up can become a prison. And so there are often times I've gotten poems or something from some young writer, and they'll say, "Well, I did just what you did in my poem," and I'll say, "Yeah, but my poem is a great poem. Yours isn't, because," and I'll list off three or
I
four
did what
things.
you did. Aren't
Yeah,
I great too?
yeah, and I'm all for the old saying about great artists steal, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. But you have to know how to steal. And let's see, one other thing. Oh, and because everyone is different, everyone's going to have their own way to work. One of the things, for example, that I often found that's very detrimental in writing groups or writing classes is when I give critique, especially to young writers who are going to be more
Mm.
impressionable. I never try to Schneiderize their poems. I'll tell you, here's what I would do
Yes.
with this line. But since you seem to be aiming for A, B,
Mhm.
or C, here's how you'd go to get to A. Here's how you'd go to get to C. Here's how you go to D. Now you may have F, G, H in mind,
Yes.
and then we can hash something out. But you never want to, as a critic, in the pre-final stage, look at someone's work and say, and try to impose yourself in it. Why would I want more writers who are like me? Not only would the fact that would it make my writing less valuable if someone
Yes.
could convincingly imitate me, but it's pointless because they're not going to have my experiences. So,
Mhm.
for example, just to use, I mentioned the gangster novel. I grew up in a Goodfellas neighborhood. I was actually talking with a coworker yesterday night on a break, and I was talking about some of the gangsters I knew as a kid growing up. But he grew up in Cleveland and moved to Texas, and he's worked in the service industry before he ended up in retail like me, and so his experience is going to be totally different. He's also a metalhead. He's still 50 something years old, goes to 1980s metal bands concerts, so he's not going to have the same experiences as me, and neither are other writers. So yes, it's a cliche to write what you know, but that's when you start out.
Yeah. Right.
If I'm just writing what I know, why would I be writing about Catherine the Great? You know.
Yes.
So you have to be able. You have to know that yourself. Know the flexibility of where you are in your life, and it's one of those things that unfortunately you have to constantly. Things are parallaxing around you. You read a
Mhm.
book, you might read a piece of shit like from someone like Volman, but you might say, that this short story that so and so wrote is a piece of crap. But if he had done conceit one, had dropped off the last 2 pages and had done these two other things, this might have been an interesting way to come to something of value. And the problem is we want in America, and just as human beings, we want simple answers. And when you're making art, in my mind, art is the highest pursuit that human beings can do, even more so than science, because it reflects who
Mm.
we are. If there are immutable scientific laws, who knows? But if there are, then that does you. No pursuit of them can be as individuated as that Wyeth painting I mentioned,
Right.
or
Right.
what I'm doing. So arts and sciences, but especially the arts, are the way we measure civilizations and their success or not. And here in the 21st century America, and I don't want to get off on bullshit with Trump and whatnot, but long before he became a president, simple answers. We just want the very idea that you would have MFA writing mills says how we want to churn things out in a Henry Ford like fashion.
Mm. Yeah, McLuhan talks about how the medium is the message, and once you start to see after the invention of the printing press, the way that people start getting slotted into society like a printed letter on a page, as opposed to the more individualized style of the medieval scribes. Um, I think it's interesting that you're one of the few writers I know of that still has like an ethos, like in the postmodern wake where meta narratives and grand narratives and everybody's doubting everything, you still do believe that actually art is the highest ideal that, in fact, can productively move us towards something greater than us at our current stage.
Because if you don't believe that, you know what happens? My wife was just watching that James Franco film about Howl, Ginsberg's Howl. I don't know
Yeah.
if you heard of it. I haven't watched it. She wants me to watch it. I'm not a big James Franco fan.
Yeah.
I used to watch. I used to see Franco on when did his stint on General Hospital, a soap opera I watched for many years. But the thing is, there, if you know Allen Ginsberg, he had the potential to be a truly great poet early on.
Caddish,
His
Powell.
his last few books though, before he croaked, he was writing poems like shit machine, we are all just shit machines, shit machine, shit. Literally, this is a page long of this stuff. This, I don't know if you know of a poet named James Tate, but he's got a
Yeah.
ridiculously bad poem about Lewis and Clark making it, and it's the same line for like 45 lines. What the fuck is the point? Or there's probably the most egregious example of this. Have you ever heard of the novel? It's the word the for like
Yeah.
10 million times. The. I mean, this is gimmick. What is okay? If I can see one or two instances where that could be parodying really bad writing or something, but otherwise it's just gimmick. Why are you wasting people's time? Is your life
Yes.
so long? When I write, I'm trying to communicate something, that in 3,000 years from now, when we're off in the cosmos somewhere, people can look back and say, at the turn of the second to the third millennium, there was this guy who was in this ancient city of New York, and I really resonate with his stuff, even though I haven't stepped foot on Earth, and my family left Earth, 10 generations ago or whatnot. You want to be able to impart. It's the same thing like whether Homer existed or not. Homer or the Homers. You know a little bit about Greek life if you've read the Iliad or the Odyssey. You know a little bit if you've read this Lucan's Civil War or some of these other ancient texts. And that's the only thing you can do, because once you're gone, you're gone. In my opinion.
Right. And I guess I'll get into this now because this is a major question that comes up in first year writing is confidence. Confidence of freshmen is very low. They don't think that not only are they not confident in their own writing, but when you get them into peer groups, they're very apprehensive about criticizing or offering feedback because they don't feel qualified to edit another's work. So my question to you is, when did you start to develop this confidence? Were you always very high self-esteem, or was this a, not to psychoanalyze you too much, but
Well, it depends on what you mean by confidence, because you don't always have the same confidence levels in all things.
yes.
My dad had a friend of his, and that friend's grandson was this little kid named Brian. When we were about 4 or 5 years old, there's a photograph of us in an alley in New York with our arms around each other, me and Brian. And my only real memory, other than that photo, is what I was that this kid ain't too bright. You want to know why? Is my dad, who only graduated from sixth grade.
Mm.
Uh, my dad was a working class union man. He hated LBJ for starting the Vietnam War. He hated Nixon even more for doubling down on it after
Right.
promising to get us out of it. Uh, he had been fired trying to unionize before he got a civil service job in New York. So I would every night when my dad came home when I was 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, it was the war, the goddamn war. These people and Nixon and I would end up parroting things my dad
Yeah.
said to my friend. Like I would ask this kid Brian, and I remember saying to him, so what are you in support of the war in Vietnam or whatnot? And maybe it was something else that my dad had said, and this kid was like Vietnam, and the drool coming down his. I remember. "Oh, this kid isn't that smart." Now I was just a precocious kid. He was
Yeah.
a normal kid, and he'd have no idea about whether the Viet Cong were good guys or bad guys, or William Westmoreland, or all this other stuff that I was drenched in because of my dad's rage against the way
Mm.
America is run. But it you just have to sort of go. And I forget now what was the original question. I got off on the
Well,
thing.
I don't know why I'm beating around the bush. My question was basically like, as a kid, did you feel
Oh yes, yes,
maybe
my
not
confidence.
confident, and then one day you write a poem and you're like, actually, that's great. I'm really good at
Well,
that,
no,
and then you gain confidence.
I knew. I'll give you an example too. When I was a kid, when I was 5 or 6 years old, the hookers around my street used to use us little kids to go out and solicit the Johns coming by,
Right,
and so
right.
we'd say, "Yeah, there's the girl in the pink," and she'd lift up her dress, spread apart her cheeks or whatever she wanted to do to give a glimpse of the goods, and I'd get a quarter, 50 cents
I
or
was gonna
whatnot.
say, did you get? Yeah, yeah.
And that was enough a soda, a Spider-Man comic, and whatever else in that day. And so I was confident in that. I got the first job I had was delivering newspapers, and the routes for this local newspaper in Queens was run by a gangster. He later then got me a job at a warehouse. This was what I was talking about yesterday with this fellow I worked with. Now, so I was confident in that manner. When I was young, there's a if you go on my one of my it's my E-Cosmoetica site, you'll see I
Yeah.
have Christmas 1972 where and you listen to me and you wouldn't know. You'd think I was living a Brady Bunch kind of life rather
Yeah.
than living a good fellow, because I was very brash and confident. I was, it's like one of these kids that shut up, Danny, just sit down, be quiet. um,
Hmm.
uh, but then you hit your teen years, and you start wearing glasses. I got
Hmm.
eyeglasses, and so you're feeling less confident. So confidence levels in my intellect, my intelligence, I never had an issue with. Confidence
Gotcha.
level in approaching girls or whatnot. I have my gap between my teeth, glasses. I'm not the football star. And then there's
Right.
confidence level in where you grew up, and all the times I saw women raped, or people shot dead, or animals being tortured or whatnot. And did I do something? Could I have done something? I would have these ethical questions in my life. So saying someone's self
Hmm.
confident, if you really look at it, there are different areas. Unless you're a narcissist like a Donald Trump, or a
Right.
lot of these other people who believe that they're good at everything.
I'm the greatest
And,
golfer that's ever lived, Dan.
but do they really believe? Because
That's the question,
I was
isn't it?
talking I was talking with that same guy a few weeks ago, and I was telling him, you know that Donald Trump is just making up for his lack, because
Very deep insecure. Yeah.
his father couldn't stand him. It was
Yeah.
Fred Trump Jr., the older
Yeah.
brother, who was the
Mm.
golden boy, and Donald was on the outs, and he spent his whole life trying to make himself up. But again, I'm getting off topic here.
Very
But
Freudian. So when did you gain confidence as a writer? What was your first? Okay, so let's just do
I
the
was
whole spiel. What was your first story that you remember writing?
well. The writer stuff goes before that. Do you know what a dozen's toss is?
A dozen, like where you're making fun of people?
Yeah. Do you know what a dozen's toss is, though? It's
No.
that this was the precursor of what became slam poetry. In Brooklyn, and you'd go to these art galleries, or sometimes you'd even bring people would have chicken cockfights and whatnot, and people would be doing rap battles or
Hmm.
stuff, and it'd be doing the does your mother wears army boots,
Yes.
and that kind of thing. And when I was 6, 7 years old, I was able to verbally tangle and beat most of the adults there, and so I knew I had a way with words. But I never did anything with that until there was this girl. I won't say her name, but there was this girl that I liked throughout high school, and she was pretty. She was intelligent in Arista and honors classes and that stuff. But she didn't have anything deeper. But I wanted to pursue her, and because I was in a gang at the time, I knew that I was the liaison between the gang that I was in and these kids who worked in the program office at my high school, who could get information on the teachers or anyone. So
Hmm.
I got this girl's address, and I decided to woo her because I was not on the football team or the basketball
Yeah.
team. I was not Mr. Cool. I was the only white kid in a Hispanic gang, and so I said,
Puerto
well,
Rican?
Puerto Rican and Colombian.
And
Um, um, and I wonder, well, how the fuck am I gonna impress her? Because well, actually there were 4 girls that I gotten information on, so I had them plotted 1 to 4. But one I'd already struck out with. Another one was a Polish girl, and then there was the black girl who I couldn't touch, because if I had brought a black girl home to my neighborhood, she'd have been raped and I'd have been lynched. But so there's one girl that I did settle on as being the one. I saw a Phil Donahue show, and I saw this Phil Donahue show about trying to woo. It was like, and some guy came, with the, roses are red, such and such is pink, whatever kind of thing. And I said, I'm better than that. And so I went to the local library, and I got Walt Whitman and a few other things. I was saying, I can do Walt Whitman stuff. This rhyming stuff is bullshit. And so for a few years, I was writing Walt Whitman-esque doggerel. And it was basically to try to get laid.
nice.
And so that's how that came. But then after it didn't work out, my pursuit of her failed. I was like,
But the writing persists.
yeah, I'm pretty good at this. And have you ever heard of the New Eurekan poets?
Yes.
So there was a girl there named Maggie Steppe. Have you ever heard of her?
Yes.
Yeah. So I knew her, and at about the time I was 19 or 20, and I failed with this other girl. I'd also failed with a girl that I liked, that I worked with. I went to a New Eurekan poetry thing, and I met this Maggie Steppe, and she was interesting. She wasn't particularly a great poet, but she ended up basically being a journalist, and she died about a decade ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and
And
you
you
know,
got hate mail from your eulogies and
yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, but so yeah, and so I knew I had a way with words, and it was just a matter of time. It took about 9 years, though, from the age of
Hmm.
19 to 28, before I wrote my first great poem.
Hmm.
I did write. I was contracted by a company that's an infamous vanity press. I won't name it because they're quite litigious. And I did publish a long poem with a vanity press, a different one. But once I had my first few great poems, I knew that I had it, and but even then, I didn't think that I could ever write narrative, because poems are about moments, generally speaking. Most lyric poetry, at least. And I said, well, I'm a great poet, but I have to be the best. And
Yes.
so once I had 10 and 20 and then 50 and then 100 and plus poems, I'm like, I got to keep going. I did that for about 12 years. I haven't written poems since '05, not because I haven't had the impulses, but I take those impulses and feed them into to novels or plays. And then I went on to the other stuff, writing that. So again, it's not my approach to writing, and my history with writing is going to be different than other people's. It worked for me. It might not work for someone else. It probably
Yes.
wouldn't. So you have to have enough confidence. The only way you have confidence, though, is if you focus on what that art is, and know the general parameters, the general stuff. The specifics have to be your own. You can have
Yes.
general principles, but the specifics have to be your own. If, for example, a woman that whose stuff that I follow on YouTube is a gal who lives up in the Svalbard Island archipelago of Norway.
Yeah.
And I bring her up not because she's really an artist. She's a photographer. She does her videos or whatnot. But her whole shtick, though, is living in Svalbard, which is interesting for about 10 or 12 videos. And I remember I commented on one of her videos, you need to do more about the history of Svalbard, interesting stuff, because, how do you take a shit in minus 40-degree weather? You're running out of
Good
topics,
question. Right. Yeah.
and it's that way with a lot of artists, is that they have such a small purview. Open it up. I said this in a number of times. Where these microbes on a little pale dot floating around a cinder in a galaxy that the observable universe might be to the smallest thing we know, Planck length. It might what's out there might be infinitely larger than even that comparison. How can you just write about yourself? I'm bored with myself. That's one, and this is one of the things people say about art is art expresses yourself. Yes, one of my expressions is I'm not satisfied with just myself.
Right.
I want to know more. I want to write about Catherine the Great. I did a trilogy of plays on the three greatest Khans. I've done plays on Alexander the Great, Cyrus the Great, and Sargon the Great. These historical figures are more interesting to me, but they do reflect. If I write a poem about Al Capone, that says something about me. I don't have to write about, my dick isn't as large as that black kid that I went to school with 30 years ago. I'm not a man. This kind of stuff is bullshit that people just get caught up in, and it's stuff that really prevents them, even if they have the talent, from actually fulfilling everything, because they're dealing with art not as something that communicates. Art is ultimately communication. It's not necessarily my identity. Who gives a shit of my identity? Do I really believe that in 1,000 years, technologically speaking, people are going to still be hung up on all this stuff about religion and race and ethnicity and identity and sexual politics?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Because if you go back 1,000 years ago, there's no way they could have predicted that in 1,000 years we'd have been on the moon 50 years ago. That we have computers that, they're going to, that 1,000-year difference is going to be probably a greater difference than where we are now to where we were 10,000 years ago.
Yes,
Again,
I think.
I'm preaching.
Well, yeah, it's preaching, but it's not religious. It's more like a secular humanist kind of approach, which I think is, when you're saying these things, I'm like, yes, indeed. The triviality of our existence means that it almost gives you a pass, where it's if you're trapped in yourself and you see a war and peace, you think that's like the end of the line, where if actually you take a step back and you realize how small you are on a cosmic scale, then writing a 700-page novel about Russia doesn't seem that imposing.
No.
And I'm just trying to put the thoughts together. So one of the people I have coming over for Thanksgiving is a step uncle, and I gave them for their birthday one of Lauren Isley's books, which I found out through through Cosmoetica. And I think this idea of the Carl Sagan pale blue dot, that kind of like, I don't know if it's really a dread as much as a recognition of the vast scale of things, somewhat impels us to create artistic works, not for our own identity's sake, but simply what else is there to do, right? Like,
looking back, if I could talk to my earlier self, I'd be like, I talked myself out of approaching this girl or that girl or whatnot, and it's like, why? The worst thing that they can do is
say no, and you move on.
That's what it is. But the human beings tend to worry about things that they shouldn't worry about so much. Yes, with art, there's an end goal that you want to have. You want to communicate this particular idea, this particular notion. But I know, for example, if getting back to the composition, I mentioned that girl who had the post-its and the timelines on her wall. That's so inorganic, and
Exactly.
I don't
That is
use
the exact word.
I don't use organic in the sense of I'm some San Francisco hippie
No,
liberal
no, no,
type.
no.
I'm
Yes.
talking about
Coleridgean sense of organicism. Yes.
if we want to be able to see ourselves in characters that are wholly fictional, those characters have to reflect certain parts of us, and you can do that by internal monologues. I've often said, forget about what a character looks like or what the color their eyes are. Get behind the eyes.
Yeah.
You define the character by what they notice. If you have Billy Pilgrim and the kid from J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye.
Oh, Holden Caulfield.
You have Holden Caulfield, and they're walking down the same street, or
They're going to see the two.
Right.
Think, yeah.
You're going to have very divergent things that are described. You could be in the same building, but you're not going to know it from that. I've often said, I could write down, for example, a description of, let's say it was Marilyn Monroe, but you're not going to necessarily know that if you ask other people to do that, because their Marilyn is going to be different than my Marilyn, just like your Ahab is different from my Ahab.
Yes.
And that's the thing is, you're always going to have these parallel texts with every reader, but it's the things that are in common that bind all of those texts in other people's minds. That's the thing that's important. You might think that Starbuck is more important than Pip, the cabin boy, but maybe in a certain interpretation for one person, Pip is a more important character because I can identify with Pip more because I was an orphan and I was sexually abused. And so Pip, and I'm using these more politically correct things to do it, but it doesn't matter whether you're using a politically correct narrative or whether you're using a narrative from a more strength, or you're using a Christian interpretation of Moby Dick, or an American political interpretation. I've read how each of the main characters represents, I think at the time there were 22 or 23 states, and they're 22.
Yeah, that was one of your insights on Moby Dick that I was like, actually, that's genius, that he was actually just doing each state as a character. Yes.
Yeah, and so, if it works, it works. But you also have to recognize, too, your own limits. This I call the fallacy of self-limits. Imagine you and I went to a gym to work out, and I go, I can lift 185 pounds over my head. And you go, I got 240. And I'm like, and in a very Trumpian way, I say, no, Liam cheated. There's no way anyone could outlift me.
Impossible.
Yeah, this fallacy of self-limits, but most people have this, not necessarily for objectively easy things to spot, like how much weight you can lift.
I play chess. This happens all the time.
Yeah, and so I'm open to the fact that, let's say someone could come up to me and say that David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest is the greatest novel of all time. Okay, show me. But when I can show you paragraph upon paragraph of absolute dog shit, it's not there. At a certain point, I'm like, the odds of this being objectively wrong are almost infinitely nil. Yes. Now I can look at someone like Faulkner, or who's the guy who did the desert of the cities of the plains, McCormick.
Cormac McCarthy?
Yeah. Cormac McCarthy and Faulkner, to me, are very similar writers because I think overall they're poor writers, but each of them can go on a 2 or 3 paragraph run that's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
But then there's 30 pages of dearth after that.
Yeah.
Proust is very much that way. I said Proust...
You might feel the same way about Joyce, right?
Yeah. Well... I think he's better than Proust, but I look at Proust, I say, Proust wrote 300 of the greatest pages ever, but it's a 3,300 page novel, so there's 3,000, so you have that little oasis, and then you have the Sahara around it. Joyce, if we want to get back to that, since you had brought him up, I think Joyce's apex was The Dead, specifically the second half of The Dead, and specifically the snow falling everywhere, and I've used that metaphor many times. I don't know if can you check?
Oh,
Can you see? There's a stack of my papers where
yeah.
I have different ideas for plays and whatnot. Behind me, you see all other papers. So I always have a pen and paper with me, and the ideas keep coming. Not every idea. I just threw away stuff that was probably 7, 8, 10 years old that I ideational. I know I was never going to go there, or I'd written something. You know, I have a note for a play I wrote 5 years ago, and I never used that point. And sometimes I'll just toss it. Other times I still have. Knock on wood, I'll get back to poetry someday. Great lines. I did. Have you ever seen that video I did of writing a poem about? I did it about a serial killer. It's on the E-Cosmoetica. It's called Dan Schneider Writes a Great Sonnet. It's about Ed Gein, the serial killer. So it's 100. I wrote it in 100 minutes, minus a minute and a half or two for the guy to change the VHS cartridge he was recording on.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, do you ever go back and watch those videos?
No, I like I said, I bore myself. I mean, yes, I will. When this gets posted, I will look at it just to see. Sometimes to critique my own performance as an interviewer. One of my best interviews was I was interviewing these two women, two separate shows because I couldn't get, there was something wrong with it. But I did two shows in one day on the afterlife: a pro afterlife woman and anti afterlife woman. The pro afterlife woman all of a sudden goes off on a talk about astral projection and how she went beyond the orbit of Pluto. And I said to her, "Wait a minute. You said this is about 10, 12 years earlier when I interviewed her in like 2018 or 19, and you know there was the Pluto flyby in 2015. I said, if you actually went past Pluto, it never occurred to you to like memorize 2 or 3 major features so that you could write it down, contact the media, and then if it turned out you're right, you've just proven that human beings actually could have a superpower. We might all evolve to be able to astrally project." But of course it didn't come down to that, and she never did. It's just like with the Bigfoot or Loch Ness monsters or angels or the Virgin Mary, all this kind of stuff. This is why I'm pretty much a materialist philosophically.
Yes. Let's see if I can jump. Well, I was going to say that philosophically, a lot of what we've been already talking about, you know, the impermanence of life, the inconsequentiality of human existence, impermanence, perfection, and imperfection. These are all very Zen concepts, really.
Yeah,
just saying, just as a comment. I don't know. I was just wondering if you're like, oh yeah, well, I read Buddhism all the time.
No, I mean I'm not religious, and I have interviewed people about Buddhism. I've done Jainism. I've done a number of the lesser known religions. I said to many people, for example, after the election, I saw a lot of preachers who were quote unquote liberal Christians, and I'm not religious. I was a Missouri Synod Lutheran raised, but I sometimes said as an agnostic, I'm a better Christian than most Christians I know. I mean, I turn the other cheek. I don't willfully try to hurt people. I whatever the Ten Commandments. I don't
spit on poor people.
Yeah, I don't kick animals or boot midgets in the back. Little people.
I'm just gonna rifle through some thoughts I have. First of all, the comment you made about repeating your dad's style of ranting. There's an article by a man named, I think it was David Bartholomew, Don
Bartholomew, yeah.
Not the short story writer.
Oh, no, okay. Okay.
It's a pedagogue with a slightly different last name, but yeah. His article is called, I think it's Inventing the University, and basically the whole concept is that there are already conventions and discourse communities that we're trying to introduce student writers to by having them essentially mimic the experts. So I thought that was very copacetic, if that's the correct term. The James Tate joke was funny to me because I'm actually talking to another comp rep person who happens to be a musician. This is a very tedious connection, but okay. So they're a musician. They had played on a record called American Water by a band called the Silver Jews in the late 90s. Many of these band members were MFA poets, and they loved them some James Tate. So I was just curious as a I've read some of Tate to try and figure out what they saw in him. I have one friend that said he was like the American Gogol, which I disagree with to a certain degree. I would think Edgar Allan Poe is the American Gogol, but as the poetic expert here, what do you find in Tate, if you do find anything?
I don't find anything. I think he's a fraud. It's one of these things. You know, this is why the abstract expressionists did so much damage, not only to their own art, but to art in general. When
Okay.
I'm just, again, getting back to the novel,
Yes.
and then, you could, take swaths of, 10,000 thes at a time and what is the fucking point? What is I look at a Jackson Pollock, and, if you look at his own painting, I've often said, there's a painter he reminds me of, Adolf Hitler's paintings. Now,
Interesting.
now I would say because they're solid enough, competent to a degree, but there's nothing outstanding about it. Now, if you're talking about ethically, I think Jackson Pollock was ethically a better person because
Yes.
he was
Yeah. One
because
arguably,
yeah.
I think he did kill a woman, right, in a drunk driving
Well,
accident.
yeah, but I mean,
Still not up to Hitler's standards of evil.
but
Yes.
but the thing with him is he his and his not only him but his agent, the famous one whose name slips my mind. They did so much damage to the intellectual life because how many times have you heard, oh, it's pigeon shit, or an elephant did it, or it's splattered like this. Well,
Mhm.
it's the motion. I've heard people say, well, it's really the motion of atoms, and what he had no idea about that. I mean, but the thing is, when something is open to infinite interpretation, there's really no interpretation.
I
There's no
see. I
artist
see.
there. You know,
Yeah.
you can't. I can. If I wrote that poem you mentioned to start about the barber, and it ends with the photo of Dresden being bombed. If 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 you take from that it's really a metaphor, or I'll give it a better one. I said if I write a poem about a poodle and you think it's a metaphor for Operation Barbarossa, well, we
Right.
failed somewhere. Uh,
Yes. Something has gone askew.
now, whether it's the artist or it's the critic or the audience, something's gone wrong because yes, you can interpret things multiple ways, and a
Yes.
duplicity of idea is good. This is why enjambment is so important in poetry, where you break a
Hmm.
line with the punctuation that you use, and you can also use it in prose. But if something, like I said, is open to infinite interpretation, there's no there when it comes to
Yes.
the artist.
Yes. The It reminds me of Roland Barthes, who said that many people remember the death of the author, but fail to remember that the death of the author was the birth of the reader. So each reader has this parallax interpretation of the same event, sort of in this cubist situation. But to the point you made, that this common denominator binding these readerly interpretations together reminds me of what Ezra Pound, speaking of 21st century fascism, but Ezra Pound commented that if he was going to try and poetically represent red, he would tell you cherry, flamingo, sunset, fire hydrant.
Mm-hmm.
And then the underlying unity of those four differential objects would somehow impart a coherent abstract thought through concrete images. And then to finally, yeah, so you're commenting about how specifically people can approach Moby Dick in different ways that seem to reflect their own self-interests. My dad was a rhetoric major. Yes, he did drama education. He wasn't much of a reader, but he would always say that, oh, I did read Moby Dick. And his one college essay that he would talk about was his thesis that Captain Ahab was manic depressive. And you go, oh, well, was your dad manic depressive? Yes, yes, exactly. You see, it's really you're just writing about yourself through the lens of these other people. Much appreciated. The comment, the repeated motif of pragmatism, I think, is also something that we try to tell. I've personally told students this semester, do what you got to do. Like, if you got to write a 2,000 word essay, whether you use a pre-draft, whether you go straight ahead, as long it's about the finished product. And we could talk for hours about different compositional methodologies. Like John Irvine starts with his last sentence, works all the way backwards before he even starts to write. Anthony Burgess, because he thought he was going to die in a year, developed this process where he would just write a page, perfectly edit it, keep going. So you can approach a text from the inside, the outside, forward, backward. People do all sorts of ways. The point about it is to, get the job done. But what your statement reminded me of is a quote from Thelonious Monk, jazz pianist, who said that a genius is someone who is most like themselves. So you may be able to write a great Schneiderian poem, but it's not great because you're not being yourself. So the pragmatism is true. Do what you got to do. But as you're doing it, you're going to accumulate skills that you notice that, oh, I'm good at this. I'm good at metaphors, which you can then form into a toolkit that you can use later.
Well, I'm not a believer in genius as a noun. I think people have a genius. Genius is a verb.
Yeah.
You could say, and
Place.
I'll give you some perfect example. Who's thought of as a genius more than anyone else? Albert Einstein.
Right.
Have you ever read Albert Einstein's book of essays, Ideas and Opinions?
Some of them actually, yes.
Yeah.
But I know where you're going.
He's a very pedestrian writer.
Yes.
He's a very pedestrian thinker when it comes to things human. Now, putting aside the fact that a biographer would say he was also a scumbag because his youngest daughter he locked up, or maybe it was the oldest daughter he locked up in an insane asylum, didn't see her until she died. Under
married his cousin,
yeah,
didn't wear socks.
All these kind of things.
Yeah.
But the point is, he was good with math, and mathematics is the basis of physics. And as far as we know, although it's looking that we're probably going to have to go beyond Einstein to get a better picture of the cosmos eventually. He's certainly important. So was he a genius? Okay, he had a genius for numbers. He was numeratically gifted. So was before him Leibniz and Newton.
Yes.
There have been some.
But
people,
it's the transitive verb. He has a genius towards something.
Yeah.
It's not his identity is.
I
not
suck
genius.
at most things. I suck at most things.
I think that's a very wise
physically, I'm average with the. I mean,
Right.
I can outwork younger kids. I've got some good endurance and whatnot. But I'm good with words. I'm good with those kinds of concepts. I listen. I don't think anyone does conversation like I do. My wife does conversation very well, but she does it. Her characters are generally more Ingmar Bergman-esque. They're more intelligent. I can do at any level. I can do the slob at a basketball game. I can do college professors. Male, female.
Well, I think you used a metaphor once where it's like you're really good at like large Masonic constructions, like a single block of a pyramid, whereas your wife is more like the really intricate details and decorations. But
yeah, and again, those things are things that when you have to be able to recognize your pros and cons and play to your strengths. Sometimes you can. If you can identify a weakness early on, and this is not just in writing, but in life in general, but the art specifically, if you can identify something you're not particularly good at, you can work on it, and you can make a strength out of it. But again, there are limits. I have a very lean body. I could take all the human growth hormone and do the Schwarzenegger thing in the gym, but I'm still going to have very thin wrists.
Yeah.
Look at that. I'm not.
I'm never going
to be Charles Atlas or Arnold Schwarzenegger.
So this is something that I did want to bring up because I had a girlfriend once and I would be like, "Oh, what's your favorite movie?" And they'd go, "I don't like favorites." Like they didn't like pinning it down. Whereas I think me and you, it's like, no, that's great, that's better than that, and that's good, like the sort
Uh-huh.
of hierarchical situation. My, I'm going to throw out my definition of greatness and see, see how you shoot it down. I think of a great musician, for example, John Coltrane. John Coltrane was great because he could have played the saxophone like anybody else, but nobody could play the saxophone like John Coltrane. So he could encompass the entirety, he could do whatever he wanted, but nobody could do what he did. Same goes for Picasso. Picasso could paint like Velasquez, he could paint like Matisse, whatever, but nobody could imitate Picasso. That's my definition of greatness. And then I think Gregory Corso further categorized it between like there's great, there's perfect, and then there's divine. And for some reason, he felt that Percy Blythe Shelley was the most divine poet of all time, which I found fair enough, right? But I was just curious if you had an operational definition of greatness that you work with, or is it more of an eye test?
Um, I mean, I use, having grown up in the New York City public school system, I use the simple 1 to 100 scale. I would say stuff that is
Gotcha.
great, I would
Right.
grade at 95 plus. 90
Gotcha.
to 94, I would grade at near grade. 85 to 89 would
That's
be
it.
excellent. 80 to 84 would be very good. 70 to 75 to 80 would be good, and then you'd have mediocre passable. Under 65 is a failure. It
Yes.
doesn't matter whether
But
something's a
you're very
four.
stringent. You don't like grade inflation. You're no bullshit. I'm going to say that, James Joyce was a 76 or whatever. Like, you're not. Nowadays, we have a problem with grades because we feel compassion toward the students. So we may end up giving somebody a 90 because of their background rather than this is a genuine 90
Yeah.
paper.
Well, let me just make a point, and we'll get back to that. Is also though I have what I call the infinity spike when the difference between something that I would grade say a 96 and something I would grade at a 92, let's say,
Okay.
that four point difference
It's
I think
huge.
is huge and bigger than say the 92 to the 42.
It's logarithmic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it just just vroom.
Yes. One of the professors I have uses the metaphor of gymnastics, where in gymnastics, they grade you on difficulty. So you may have written a great poem, but if it was pretty low hanging fruit, you're going to max out at an 85 or whatever. Whereas if you tried something crazy and you still pulled it off, that gets higher
Well,
marks.
yeah, and I mean, this goes. I mean, obviously, I think there are things like great haikus,
Mhm.
but a haiku is still just 17 syllables and
Yes.
three
Yes.
lines. I have a friend. I don't know if you've seen on Cosmoetica. I mentioned his name is Bruce Ario. He
Yes.
has a
R.I.P.
documentary that was just premiered, and hopefully over the next few months, the DVD will come out.
Were you
Bruce,
involved with that?
I'm his literary executive, but I didn't make the film. I'm
Oh,
interviewed
okay.
in the film, but he wrote a 10-line thing called an aerial. I named it the aerial form. It's free verse, three stanzas of 333, and then a 10th line separate, a fourth stanza where the poem sort of just takes off. Now he wrote a lot of doggerel, but his best stuff is great, and it very much mimics the form of the English sonnet. Um,
Hmm.
but now, what was I gonna say? Oh God, see, I
Well,
just
you're just you don't. I'm looking for the idiom. I can't come up with it, but you don't inflate the grade, right? For
no,
you,
no.
85 is 85. I'm not,
Well, but
I'm not putting this in the
again,
best terms, but I think you know what
there,
I'm
there
talking
are
about.
many roads to nirvana. If we have a poem that, let's say I have a couple of poems that I think are a 95, I'm gonna be like, okay, now you can come to it by having written a poem that sustains itself over 5 pages, something like that Custer poem that I mentioned. But
Hmm.
also, you could have just a dynamite a sonnet, something like Archaic Torso of Apollo by Rilke, if you
Yeah,
get a good translation, not Robert Bly, but someone else.
fair.
Uh, and that's only 14 lines. That might be, now I think that's probably more a 97 or a 98, but again, there are no two things are going to be ultimately
Yes,
equivalent. I
right.
think
Yeah,
I
yeah,
believe absolutely that there are objective things. I can objectively say, for example, that Rilke is a greater poet than James Tate. That does
yeah,
not mean, though, that when he was 17, before he decided to cop out and just become a hack, he might have written something close to greatness. And that poem, I could probably find a Rilke poem that isn't as good as the best poem that
yes,
James Tate
right,
ever wrote.
yes.
But
This reminds,
on the whole, it's inarguable that
yes,
Rainer Maria
yeah,
Rilke
yeah. On
was
the
a
whole,
greater
yeah.
poem than James Tate, greater poet. Yeah, I'll give you another example. I was just recently. I've been trying to. I want to do this interview because I'm so sick and tired of American stupidity. A guy I'm going to interview had
What American stupidity are you talking about, Dan? This is
all
a
general.
shining beacon on the hill.
Yeah, and this guy has did a little 10-minute documentary thing on a guy who claims he saw Bigfoot. So then, of course, because I watched this, I'm getting all these Bigfoot things, the Patterson Gimlin Bigfoot, thing with
Well, we
the
need the Dan Schneider Bigfoot novel is what we need.
yeah, but the thing is, it's so obviously not real.
Yes.
I've done 5 or 6 shows on UFOs and this woman who flew past
Astral
Pluto
projection.
and
Yes.
whatnot. And it's such bunkum, but people don't want to come out and say stuff like that because everyone has truth. And the funny thing is, it's everyone has that. It's not just the liberals or progressives that want to talk about trans rights. I've said to people many times is, wait a minute, you're telling me how weird it is that someone wants to cut off their genitals to become the opposite sex, but yet you believe in some sky wizard that created
Well,
everything and whatnot. I'm going to tell you this much. I believe I could find you a trans man, whatever you think about it, that truly believes that they should have been
yeah.
born the other
Yeah.
sex. Then you can show me any
Yes.
proof of
Yeah.
God. So don't tell me that person is off their rocker. Even if they are off their rocker for a different reason, it's not as
It's
egregious as
not that. Yeah, right.
being
Right.
you off the rocker by having a totally misconstrued idea of the cosmos.
Yes. Well, and what gets me is that they're very against the Joe Rogan-y MMA UFC types are very against trans people using human growth hormones like estrogen, but then they're the same ones that turn around and use steroids to make
Yeah,
themselves appear more masculine.
and all of these people, even Arnold Schwarzenegger, I've heard him admit that this made him feel good about himself, that he was finally
Yes.
strong
It's the
because he
same
had a
thing.
Nazi dad, just like Elon Musk, just
Right.
like Trump.
Yeah.
He had a Nazi, a literal
A
Nazi,
literal
German
Nazi dad.
Nazi from
Yes. Yeah.
Austria.
It's hard to.
He
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
so in order to overcome the family shame. He felt shame.
Oh.
He had to build up.
Wow.
I mean,
Wow. Deep.
Schwarzenegger is like a Republican, but he's a
Yes.
liberal Long Island
Well, I
Republican,
was
as
going to
we
say
say.
I'd much rather have Arnold Schwarzenegger as president than Donald Trump, but that not to get into
Yeah, well, but
politics.
here's the thing. I lived in Minnesota under Jesse Ventura, the pro
Yes,
wrestler. All these
the
celebrities that think that they
Stormite
can do it
paint.
suck ass. I mean, Jesse Ventura was a terrible governor. From what I've read,
Oh,
so
I'm
was
sure, right?
Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, yeah. How could he be good? He's a wrestler. He knows nothing about politics. Yes. Let me ask you, since you do interviews, do you just cold approach people through emails?
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and then I'll
Seems
have
pretty amenable.
I'll have a handful of things that I want to talk about, but I don't overplan interviews.
Yeah.
I think the best interviews are not when you're the supplicant approaching the Buddha, but if you're
Mm,
just having a
a
conversation eye
dialogue
to eye.
conversation. Yeah. Yeah. It's like jazz improv riffing. The Catherine play, how long do you estimate that's going to take you to write? How many pages and how long would it take you to write?
It'll uh, I finished. So the last couple of years, I did a couple of novels. I did a novel on what's her name, the old movie star. See, again, I forget these things. It's not because I'm going senile. It's just as I'm getting older, too much
2 months.
information
Yeah.
bombards me. The last one I did was basically a sci-fi riff on a benevolent dictator. A guy acquires a lot of powers, and the surprise is he actually does a good job. But then I did a Lauren Isley play, and then I did Hannibal Barker, his fan play. Then I did what's the last one I did? I forget. And now I'm doing the Catherine the Great play. So it takes a week or so to get the stuff in between. But it usually takes a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks to write the play. When I first started writing plays in 2017, my first 27 plays I did in 26 weeks. But I was working a favorable schedule where I could come in, and it only took 3 or 4 days to write a play because I'd have like 8 hours a day. So in 24 hours, I was going to do that. I mentioned I'd written this poem on camera. I told the guys who did the film for this fellow Bruce Ario, and they're going to do some films on other poets that I've known, and then maybe eventually me. But I said, don't just if you want to, I don't do just a biography of me. I want to write a play on camera, so that it might take 30 hours over the course of 7, 8, 10 days. Film me what, and you can do the thing where you're typing and you see the words going across as I'm writing, and take that and make it a 2 or 2.5 hour play or film or whatnot, and interspersed with me talking about it, because I want people to see that
the compositional process.
I'm not. I call it the divine inspiration fallacy. I'm not reaching up into the heavens and pulling down wisdom. It's coming from me. I'm a believer in free will. When I hear people talk about there being no free will, there's so many arguments I can make against. I'm not going to get into it, but it's me. The art is a reflection of me, as I said earlier. If I wanted to write a poem about the joys of farting, whether and somehow it was a comically funny poem or whatnot, that reflects something about me.
That's how I feel about Bukowski, is most of his poems are just the joys of farting.
And Bukowski is not the worst poet.
But he's not the best. He's very overrated, but that's me personally.
But I think that he is someone who, if he had worked at it, he might have been able to been a good solid writer at some point. The problem is most people don't stick with it, and the two tragedies, if you want to call them that, are the line in The Second Coming by Yeats is those. Let me look it up. Second Coming.
Is that the one with slouching toward Bethlehem?
Yeah, I want to get the quote right. So Second Coming, Yeats. There's a line that he has at the okay. So The Second Coming. Click on it, and so he goes. Let's see. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity.
Yeah.
I've known so many people who don't have a fucking ounce of talent in their bodies, but I need to be Emily Dickinson. On the other hand, even worse is those people that have some real talent, but they're distracted. They give up on it. They don't. They don't really. They don't have the passion to match their ability. And both of those, I've seen so many examples of it, and it's really frustrating.
Yeah. The comment you made from the Yeats quote reminds me of something I saw about Herman Hesse. He put up a sign after he became somewhat famous outside his house that was like, "No visitors." What ended up happening is that the stupid people would see the sign and go, "Well, he's not talking about me. I'm not going to go knock. I'm going to go knock on his door anyways." Of course, Herman Hesse wants to see me, the random grocer from Nuremberg or whatever. Meanwhile, the smart people would see the sign and go, "Oh, I'm fair. I don't want to approach that." And so I was curious if the same thing recapitulated itself with the people who email you. Do you still get a lot of very dumb emails?
I mean, emails, or when I comment on something,
Just the stupidity abounds. It can't be avoided.
But I mean, it is what it is. I don't
Yeah.
obsess on it. I mean, because there's
No.
nothing I can do. It. There's more of them than there are of me,
Yes.
and you know, they.
Well, and not only that, but to your point, that someone who's a genius, like, or can have moments of genius, like Albert Einstein, can also be an idiot. He might not know how to bake a cake or whatever.
And
Um,
here's another point. Just since we're tossing out famous names, I talked about why I think art is the most important thing. Let me give you an example, and I say this to all people, and you can use this too. Is ask someone, have you ever heard of Johann Sebastian Bach?
mhm.
Have you ever heard of Picasso? Have you ever heard of Kubrick? Now you can substitute Shakespeare
Yeah.
or what, but three people from the last few centuries, and they say, "Oh yeah, I've heard of him." And ask the people, say, so in the province that Bach was born in, or that Picasso was born in, or in the borough of New York City that Kubrick, the Bronx, was born
Mhm.
in, name me the richest person that existed in that at that time of his birth or his lifetime,
Right.
and whether no one's going to care.
So art is more valuable than wealth. What a shocking concept.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's like Van Gogh died. So people always look to these artists that were in poverty, or Kafka
Yeah.
died from the stomach
Yeah.
cancer or whatever he had.
Right.
You know, Joyce was done in by syphilis.
Yeah.
Van Gogh was done in by whatever his mental ills or whatnot, or alcoholism or this or that.
Yeah.
But what they don't pick up on is in the long run, that doesn't matter. Just like we were talking about the pale blue dot, there's the famous Carl Sagan quote about all of the wars, all of the conquerors, all of the charlatans, all of the great people, they all existed on this dot.
Yeah.
That's all we
Yeah.
know of. And so, who cares that
Yeah.
Elon Musk, Elon Musk is a fraud. He's a slightly smarter version of Trump, but he's a fraud.
Their
All of these
robber
billionaires,
baron
the
comes to
only the
mind.
only things they care about is their moment. They don't care about how it's going to affect Greenland and the ice sheet, or the ice sheet in
Yeah.
Antarctica. They don't care
No, they don't
about
give
the
a shit.
ring of
No.
garbage. They don't care about the bleaching
No.
of coral reefs. They don't care about hundreds of millions of people that are going to die or be
Mm.
displaced, because they're going to long be gone.
Yeah.
And then they're going to want like Andrew Carnegie or Rockefeller. They're going to have their centers, or Bill Gates Foundation with his ex-wife, or this one. Who gives a? Maybe if you actually paid people decently, maybe
Mm.
again, I could go on and on.
Yeah. Right. I did want to mention that I don't know, maybe boost your ego a bit, but I stole your idea of composing on camera. I tried to do it myself. There's a thing called Twitch. I tried streaming. I'm writing a detective novel. So I started streaming writing a detective novel. And then all my friends would message me like, Liam, what the hell are you doing? So I stopped. But for the writing class, I often include, because I teach virtually, I include short videos. So I'll just write an essay,
Mhm.
and then they can just be like, oh, that's how it's done. So I think, you know, I just find it fascinating. I find the going back to the book, where they're trying to do something that's a style of performance art, but there's really nothing there. It's somewhat shallow and pedantic. But
It's like some big goober in a porno film just walking around with an eternal erection saying, "My penis is big, my penis is big, my
that would be
penis is
interesting.
big." And
I'd
by the
watch
way,
that.
feel free to use my sonnet 100-minute video in one of your online classes,
Yeah.
or recommend it.
Well, that's the thing, is that I'm really teaching an academic writing. If I was going to do creative writing, I have a lot of ideas about it. Basically, I would just start them off with haikus.
Yeah.
Figure out how to put three words together that actually have some sort of verve to it. But um, the question I had was, where do you get your ideas from? No, the question I had is, how do you generally have a theme in mind that you're trying to pair, or does it evolve naturally? Like with the Catherine the Great play, do you have a theme in mind, or did you just
Let me
find
show
the
you. Let me
characters
show you.
themselves to be interesting?
Let me show you something. So this is my writing in the back. If I don't know if you can see it, but I just pulled two post-it notes from my old Windows 7 thing that I write on. So here are the two post-it notes. And so as I'm working, filling up shelves of milk or cleaning up baby puke in the aisle or whatever I'm doing in my retail job, things come to me, or they come to me when I'm writing or talking with anyone. So I wrote here later scenes. Lee, Mom, Kathy, and Catherine the Great. This is just a note to my. These are some of the
Yeah.
characters in the play. Then I had several dreams. So the conceit is that the main character, this young black woman who's dissatisfied with her life, has read a book about Catherine the Great, and she's going to have moments where she falls into pretending
Think she
she's
is
Catherine the
Catherine.
Great.
Yeah.
This way, we can have a little miscegenation between the Russians and a
Mm-hmm.
black
Mm-hmm.
chick, just to throw at some people. So I wrote another one. I wrote. I dreamt I told Jess a dream of Bruce. I had a dream last night of this Bruce Ariel. So I'm going to have that character have a dream about someone they knew. And then
Gotcha.
here, Kathy tries to remember her own cat, Oscar, his sounds and ways. Because I sometimes I'll look at a picture of an old cat that I owned, and I'll forget what their meow sound like.
Mm.
Now, something like this, you say, well, what
Yeah.
the fuck does it have to do with Catherine the Great? But these are the little things that
Yes.
come into all of our minds. The only difference is,
Yes.
and this gets back to the genius thing, is I know how to take something like this and make something valuable dramatically in a play or a poem or a book. Most people, it just is a little whist that maybe makes them
Yeah.
smile because they remember their dog Fido.
But they
But
don't
for
know how
me,
to.
for
Yes.
me, I can make it into art
Incorporation.
because I
Yeah.
know how to do it. Let me just put that back there. So
Yes, two things about that is I've had this, and I'm sure you've also had it where this is what Kafka referred to as the second state, where you just start writing and then by the end of the night you just have a story finished and you're like, I guess that was like that. But then with these longer formats, two things is I think of it kind of like, I don't know, like a skateboarder. Like they know these two big tricks are going to happen somewhere in their competition run. And then it's a matter of linking these moments together, right? Which goes back to what I think Basho said about haiku. He said there are many of his students that can write haiku as well as he could. His, lack of a better word, genius, he was really good at linking them together. So there would be these haiku parties. They weren't just single units. You would say a haiku, then another person would say a haiku. Eventually this evolved to where you would have a haiku and then a linking verse in another haiku. So Basho was saying he was very good at these linking moments. That's my question to you is how do you know that your transitions are great? You might have a great scene in mind where you're like, actually having like Cat onto Catherine and then Catherine with a K onto Catherine, that's a great scene. Here's another great scene. How do I maintain that coherence and consistency of greatness?
well, for me, it's getting behind the eyes. When I know ideas come and they sort of ripen. I wrote. You mentioned the book, The Vincetti Brothers. That I had an idea writing about these three actual brothers I knew for 20 years. I was initially wanting to do poems about them, a poem sequence, maybe a long poem or this. Not. It wasn't until I got really great at writing a novel I said, that's it. And I saw this.
They should be a novel, yes.
And then I saw this film by called Rocco and His Brothers by Luchino Visconti, an Italian filmmaker. And it was a very good melodrama. I mentioned that I watch soap operas. Watching melodrama is
Yeah.
you can learn so much in writing
Yes.
good drama from that.
Pacing,
But
everything.
yeah,
Yeah.
but then taking it up. But
I see.
I mentioned those post-its there. Now those post-its, that's what most people would call something that's inspiration. That's the snow that's falling at the end
Yeah.
of the dead, all over Ireland. I constantly have these ideas coming. It's like the Matrix thing; those numbers coming down too.
Right.
But the skill, there's also the skill aspect, and this is when knowing. There are sometimes, and I've read so much that sometimes things come back to me. I often use Project Gutenberg, and so maybe I'm writing a play about something, or I'm writing in my novel, and I want to have a scene, and I think oh, maybe in that Jack London book, the one about the sea wolf or something. There's a scene, and I'll go reread it. And I'll say,
Yes.
oh, and I'll say, okay, this is set on a ship. This scene is set in a barbershop. But if I take the arc that's from the ship and set it in the barbershop, I can have something transformative. To just give a
Yeah.
smaller example is, if I use a cliche like "my heart was broken," and from a poem, it's from a great poem by To Sylvia or something.
Yeah.
That's by something, by some other writer. I might I might not like. I might not like the way that's framed in that poem, but I say that's an interesting way to frame it. But that person didn't do it as good. What if I take that framing device
Yeah.
out and use it in a poem about Genghis Khan wondering whether he's going to wipe out the Tangut people. And now, so something that's a total cliche in a love poem,
Remixing it.
yeah, can become something brilliant because it's the final turn of the light bulb before the light goes on. That one little twist then totally transforms everything else in it, and I can go from a poem to I can watch a Laurel and Hardy film from 1929, one of their early talkies, and there might be a moment that the way Stan hits Ollie over the head with something that even if I'm not writing
That's
about
the
someone
thing,
hitting
right?
something
Yeah.
over the head,
Yeah.
I say it.
That
The way that
thing.
he did that, that's the way my character's argument
Yes.
is going to affect another character.
Yes.
And so again, it's one of those things that you have to be open to it, but you
Yes.
have to also know what you're doing, because if
Yeah.
you can be open to something, but you're going to be overwhelmed by it, and you're not going to be able to do anything. But
Yeah.
so knowing yourself, knowing what to take and when to take it, how to take it, what to do with it, it's one of those things that's again, a young writer, I'm so overwhelmed, but it really isn't. If you find someone who has that potential, there's a young girl that I talked with a couple of weeks ago. She's from Ireland. I've never met her personally. Her name is Laura Woods, and she has the potential to be a really great poet. And I can see, though, in her poems, things that she's stolen from me or stolen from my wife Jessica, and that does, these people who talk about plagiarism, there's a difference between something that's plagiarized. If I write a great poem about my dog named Spot who died of leukemia, and his last wish was to chew on a certain type of bone, and someone has the exact same thing, the same lines, and it's just Spot instead of Fido, that's plagiarism. But when you're taking something, as I said, and transplanting it across genres or across, art forms, it isn't like that. This girl has that ability.
Yeah.
Now she's only 27 or 28, so she's right at the point where I became a great poet. Now she has an advantage. She's got me. I didn't have me to help me.
Right.
I did it. I don't want to go to this whole bootstrap thing. Yes, I learned from Whitman. I learned from the masses of reading, but I didn't have someone that I could Skype with, or Zoom with, like we're doing,
Right.
and go poem by poem and explaining things. But then again, there are people that I've done this for, and I don't hear from them ever again, and it's frustrating because like I said, some of these people have that ability. They're not going to necessarily be at my level. They may not be at Yeats's level. But if you told your average person in an MFA writing program that you could have 5 good books of poetry with 3 or 4 great poems scattered within, most would take that. And there's a guy. Let me see. Hold on. Do I have him? I can't find it. I don't know if you ever heard of him. There's a poet named Mark Van Doren. His son, Van Doren, James Van Doren, well, I forget what it was. His son initiated the quiz show scandal of the 1950s because he was getting answers. Charles Van Doren. But Mark Van Doren is actually going to be known long after his son's scandal has faded into trivia.
Interesting.
Because he was a very good poet. I've got, and here's the thing, I have a slim volume of his stuff, maybe about 30 poems, and it's a good thing. But when I have his collected poems of 800, 900 poems, he comes off much better because he's consistently solid.
Yeah.
Maybe he has 2 or 3 great poems out of the 900,
Yeah.
but the rest of them, I'm just missing a little thing. But it's important that someone like him stays in print because he's much more relatable than saying, I'm going to be like Whitman and change the face of poetry.
Yeah.
Whitman has that, if you want to call it, that kind of godlike effect. Same
Yeah.
thing with a Mozart or a Beethoven or a
Yeah.
Bach or Shakespeare or the Beatles. And some of that's overrated. I mean, I can say that Shakespeare was a great writer, but he's also maybe the most overrated writer
Yeah.
of all time because he wrote a lot of shit sonnets.
Yeah.
He wrote 2 longer poems.
Long
in a piece
poems, nobody reads them.
And
Yeah.
and you know, I think his comedies are atrocious. But having
They're not
said
very
that,
funny. No.
but having said that, you know, I'm not going to say he's not a great writer. He
Right.
certainly is. The Beatles, I think, are overrated too. I call this the founder syndrome. When people who are the first in some field are often vastly overrated than the people who are the second, third, fourth generation who come after that and say, oh, here's what the Beatles did. I'm going to go this way and do better. You know.
Yep. Well, and then it's funny. I see a lot of it's kind of like the evolutionary process where it's like you'll have a bunch of different species at once, and then one becomes the predominant type. And then that type then goes through more evolutionary processes and becomes different species, et cetera, et cetera.
But you can often be fooled. It's interesting. I was watching a video this was it yesterday or this morning? So you've heard of Brontosaurus. There were
Yes.
these things called Brontotheriums, which in the early Cenozoic, these were these horse-like creatures that evolved into something like rhinoceroses. And the idea was, who was it? Edward Drinker Cope had this idea that if most predation went away, if species got larger, and it seemed to be in the fossil record that these Brontotheriums got larger and larger and larger. But what they found later on was that they also had smaller speciations and middle ground speciations, but because of certain climatological things that happened, the smaller versions went extinct first, which gave the impression of the linear going up in size rather than a brachiation of everything into all areas.
Yeah.
And the smaller and medium sized, intermediate sized stuff went away. So, and you can be fooled like that in art too. I often see, one of the worst things I see is these people who have these fucking YouTube channels, and they're talking about writing. How to do this, how to make these obviously just commercial ideas that are absolutely terrible. But then you have people who will do 10 best books or 10 best writers or whatnot, and not only are the choices generally bad, but the reasons that the people put forth is just always this emotion. And you've probably seen this many times. I talk about, you have got to, critically speaking, get rid of emotion. You have to be able to approach it. Now, if you have 2 things that are fairly equal, a great film by Tarkovsky and a great film by Bergman, yeah, I can say, well, maybe I prefer Tarkovsky because I understand her. I prefer Yasuhiro Ozu to Kurosawa, but Kurosawa is a fantastic filmmaker. You have to be able to though step back and look at the work itself. But people often entwine emotion too much into these things, and it's to their detriment, I think.
And not just emotion, but not to get too Aristotelian with it, but people can emotion and then ethos can play into it. Somebody can think that particularly happened with like the socialist realists, right? Where they thought that if this book has a good ethical motivation, that makes it a good work of art, which is not necessarily the case.
Well, yeah, I mean, qualitative goodness and ethical goodness are two separate domains.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
they don't. You know, I've said this many times. If Dr. Mengele was a great sonneteer, I'd have no problem praising his poetry, but praising the man's life as a whole
Yes.
would be a
That's
different.
another good point. Yeah.
It's a different thing. It's like and then it's I was sending around, emailing around to do a thing on Woody Allen's film Another Woman with Jenna Rollins in it. It's a great underrated film, but you know there are people like I
He's
can't
Woody
watch
Allen. I
Woody.
can't do that. Yeah.
What I can't watch Woody Allen. He's not been convicted of anything. The evidence, if you watch a few of the videos pro or con, is overwhelmingly in his favor that he's not that fucking stupid. Yes, I wouldn't I would have wanted to leave him alone when he was 45, 50 years old with my 19, 20-year-old daughter. But by the same token, there's a big difference between what he's been accused of and whatnot. And and yet the people who will condemn Woody Allen, even fucking Mia Farrow praises Roman Polanski, who admitted to raping a woman.
Yeah. So we're almost somewhat wrapping up here. I kind of wanted to. So in the last 10 years, you've started writing plays. Before that, you were writing poems. You're writing less poems now. Why did you move from poems to plays? I would assume it's because you felt there was more territory to explore there. But I guess the real question was, what would it take for you to start writing poems again?
Well, you can flay me with this. I just got too good at poetry. I mean, I could literally almost fart out a poem. It was almost like being godlike, and it's like I got bored with it. So by '05, I had started writing short stories and some early stuff for novels. I did the novels and the short stories back and forth generally for about a decade, and then when I was working a janitorial job in 2017. I said, let me do drama. Let me do that. And as I said, I wrote 27 in the first 26 weeks, and I think the very first play I did was it's the most traditional type of play, but I would put it in, maybe third place. I put maybe two O'Neill dramas. Iceman Cometh and Long Day's Journey as better than that, but that play was better than the rest of his stuff, and I just it was a way just to talk more directly, to talk, because people can often talk more directly about things. If you've ever watched two women talking, they talk face to face. They're looking each other in the eye. They're making the emotional connection. Two men talk like they're sitting in the bleachers and they're looking out. Man, that redhead last night, Billy, man, she had the greatest fucking body. Yeah, man, her tits were spectacular. But they're imagining their dream girl off there, whereas women have that, and men have the testosterone that makes that looking in the eyes almost impossible without a one-upsmanship coming in. But understanding the way people talk. And just have them talking about things, and also having them talk around things. You could have, for example, a father and a son sitting at that same baseball game talking about Mickey Mantle or Reggie Jackson or Barry Bonds or whatever, and they're really talking about something different. And you have to know how to drop in one or two little hints of this metaphor that gets everything going around. One of the best moments in one of my greatest book, not necessarily my best book, my greatest, A Norwegian in the Family, which is 2.5 million words. And I call it the greatest because it's harder to sustain greatness over 2.5 million words than over 600,000 like War and Peace. One of the best scenes I have is there's a scene where one of the main gangster characters is a young adult, and he sees one of the neighborhood kids throw over. Yes, Jessica, calm down. My wife wants me to end.
Are you going to mention the Bruce film?
I talked to them about the Bruce film. It's my conscience on my shoulder. But in New York, people would throw around tied together sneakers around telephone and electrical wires. And so he sees one of the local kids has had his sneakers thrown up there. And we follow the course of over 20, 21 years. every time he passes that block, he sees those same two sneakers up there because no one's come to take them down. Then eventually the rain and the wear, and one time he goes there and they're gone. And it's a greatly poetic scene because little conversations that he has as he's looking up at the sneakers with a priest or a butcher or something. He remembers all of these things, and it's a great way to portray the progression of the person, even though he's a malignant murderer and mobster. It's a great way to show his human side because he remembers that kid, and that kid was killed in World War II, but the sneakers are still up there 15 years after this guy died, and then they're gone. And when they're gone, that kid that he knew is gone. Because as long as those sneakers were up there, that kid was alive. Now, this is not the kind of thing that that girl who was doing her timeline, use sneakers on telephone wires to represent the... You can't. Yes. This is something that has to come naturally when you have this sort of Whitmanian approach to life. Be open. Listen to all things. Most of it you're going to shed. It's not going to come to it. But of all those snowflakes that are coming down over Dublin, 2 or 3 of them are going to be worth it in that particular moment. You just have to know which snowflake it is.
Absolutely. Coleridge made a criticism of Shakespeare where he talks about organicism. I think he contrasts him with Ben Jonson, where it seems like Ben Jonson was more like the Post-it note in a series, and every plot point is figured out, and it's very traditional and conservative, whereas he uses the metaphor of a bee for Shakespeare, where Shakespeare would kind of just like go to a flower here, take some pollen here, a little bit over here, mix it all together, which results in these plays that don't have a traditional narrative consistency, which people expected, but that ultimately, that organic building out of these smaller cells is what, people read Hamlet far more than they ever read any Ben Jonson. So and that's the other point about it, is that you can't really tell, right? If you're planning everything, you may be able to get a better idea of what's going to work and what's not going to work. When you're working organically, you have the potential to create works that surpass the inorganic stuff, but you're also going to have to do a lot more work just to find what actually is great.
So it took me 17 months to write that Norwegian in the Family. 2.5 million words, and I was just doing sometimes 10,000-15,000 words a day. But here's the thing: over that period of time, as I'm going through drafts, and I did like 17 drafts, as I'm going through it and going back, 3 months, 8 months, 10 months, 13 months down the line, I'm going to have better ideas.
Yes.
Coming back to the same thing.
And then you have to revise things.
I'm going to keep some of the best things, and I'm going to come back and work them over. And so that there are a few times I had poems that came almost fully formed to me, and I just had to put them down. Usually they're under a page. But coming back to something, so when I have like this past week because of Thanksgiving, I didn't have as much time to finish my previous play and it was a week behind where I wanted to be, and I'm starting fits and fits and whatnot doing this play. It's frustrating, but then I say, okay, well, I'm going to take the bright side about it and say, now it might take me a week longer, but what things would I have missed? Now I also have this idea of what I'm going to do. I'm probably going to write a book, and I'm going to write a novel. But what I'm going to do is, when I'm about the midway point in my mind, I'm going to save that draft, and I'm not going to toss it as I'm going on. I'm going to write that book. Then what I'm going to do is 3 or 4 years later, I'm going to go back to the midway point of that book, because I don't reread my earlier books unless I'm proofreading or something. I'm going to go back and I'm going to write that novel again. I'm going to see I'm going to have, say, maybe it's the 2027 version and then the 2030 version of two books that I've written from the same time, and see where I went. Because inevitably it's going to change, because I'm not going to remember everything I wrote there. I might remember a few things, but I might deliberately put them aside. It's just an interesting thought experiment. And one thing I wanted to say about Shakespeare, and I mentioned this young Irish girl who has the potential to be a great poet. She gave the best summation of Shakespeare as a poet that I've ever had, because we're talking about William Shakespeare versus John Donne, and she agreed with me that John Donne is a far superior poet.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked her, well, why do you think so? She said, and I can't do an Irish accent, so you'll miss that. But she said, when I read Donne, everything that he writes seems natural. When I read Shakespeare, it's obvious to me that he's choosing some words just to fill out the line.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and that's exactly what I saw years earlier. I never put it into words, but she at this point was 23 or 24, and this is why I consider her. I say, if I ever had a daughter, and I don't know, as far as I know, I have no kids, but I'd want a kid like that, because that's my girl there. She was able to see it at 23 or 24,
Right.
even before she had the ability to write great poems herself. And I said, and again, Shakespeare is a great writer, no doubt about that. But let's not get to the point where we're saying everything that he wrote was great. John Donne was a far better poet than William Shakespeare. He came just 20 or 30 years later. So when people say the greatest poet in the English language was William Shakespeare, I said, well, John Donne, by 1700, John Donne was a better poet. And then,
Milton,
Whitman and whatnot. So anyway, that's just another thing off the top of my mind.
Well, I think the difference between you and I is my philosophy is that there's already been so much greatness. All these writers, their ambition is to write great. Nobody wants to write a book that isn't great. So what ends up happening is we have this accumulation of really great works, and you could grade them however you want, but the point is that they're all after accomplishing greatness in literature. And my philosophy is that means that there's this, I envision a map of literature that people are exploring. Borges is over here, Joyce is over here, and they're filling out the map. The unexplored territory is bad writing, which is why I'm personally interested in people like Volman or something, where things are going tremendously wrong. Something is not working. These books are too long. Almost nothing works. The same with Shakespeare, where you'll read a line of Shakespeare and it's so artificial. It's very chemically flavored or something, because he might be, showing off, or is he just filling the line?
Shakespeare also did many versions of the same kind of poem.
Yes.
My wife also says the same thing about Hess. Demian is his young man novel, but my wife read 3 or 4 of his earlier novels. She said that are basically just run-ups to Demian.
I was going to say the exact same thing, and I think this will probably be a good concluding point, is when I was reading your Hess criticism of Siddhartha, it really, I don't know why it didn't occur to me, but it seems like almost every Hess novel is almost the same. You have a binary.
Kafka, the outsider who can't fit in. I mean, Kafka has what? And you have the big 3: Trial, Castle, Metamorphosis, but then you got the Hunger Artist and a dozen
or Beckett.
Other ones.
They're all writing the same story again and again and again, because they can't. With Kafka and Beckett, it would get off into the weeds, but when the theme of your writing is how we can't express anything and how language doesn't work like it is in Beckett or Kafka, you end up having to write the same story 1,000 times. But with Hess, I noticed that he does this Jungian duality. He'll have one character and their best friend, like in Siddhartha. And they go through life, and then they come together at the end, and then they compare how their life trajectories have played out. And why I think this might... that's what I thought of when you mentioned this Catherine play, was that you have the same binaries set up, but what I find interesting is that it's actually a binary through time. Whereas in Siddhartha, the binary is set up geographically, because Siddhartha and his best friend live in the same place, so their lives occur temporally at the same time. With the Catherine play, you have the 2 characters in parallel, but the times are vastly different, so you can play with that a little bit, right? By I don't know why I'm telling you this. I mean, it's your play, but just having the interleaving kind of tapestry effect that time itself can play out, because you'll have
but
like in your
let,
typical
let me put
sci-fi play about time machines. Yeah.
one of the things that you have to mention, or I have to mention, is I don't know what all of my works are going to be about.
Right.
I the process takes over in a certain way, and I've had many times when people came to me and they said, you know, I loved your poem. How do you do this? And I'll explain A, B, and C, and then it'll say, and then there was that moment where you break the line here, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I never noticed that before, but you're right, that is something, because what you're doing is you're not putting down the text, you know, in granite. What you want to do is have it open so that there are reasonable interpretations different that can come to it. Like I said, if you're writing about a poodle and you're thinking about Operation Barbarossa, there's something wrong. But you can have the actual text, you can have the umbra and the penumbra, and in that
Yeah.
umbra and penumbra, you can have reasonable interpretations of a line, of a character, of a scene, of a political interpretation, a religious theme, and I'm not. There's no way I can at least consciously
Come
be
up
in
with all
control of all
those.
that. But
Right.
what I'm doing is I'm opening the gates for you to possibly do that. Your sister or your brother or your girlfriend or your mother's butcher are going to have maybe something else they can find in that penumbra different from you. As long as it's reasonable and not, you know, totally wacky, that's fine. Just two other things I
By all
wanted
means.
to say. I'm not a big fan of Joseph Campbell. You've probably seen something where
Right.
I've talked about him. So I don't believe in the whole bullshit about all stories are one, or you know,
Yeah, the Kurt
the myth
Vonnegut
is a
line,
hero.
right?
That
Yeah.
is so fucking destructive. Number one, you just have to read Beowulf. He doesn't follow that outline. You read Gilgamesh, doesn't follow that outline, despite what people try to say. But let me just end with this, since you had mentioned this. I think the great unexplored country, if you want to use a cliche, is not the Volmans and the shit. The shit is out there.
Yeah.
The shit just keeps coming. In that sense, I agree with Ginsburg. Shit, these guys are just, these writers, these
Yes.
badass are
Yes.
just shit machines. But there are an infinite number of ways to get greater. If I'm writing a poem as a heterosexual male wanting to talk about a beautiful woman that I saw 35 years ago on a subway train, there are going to be an infinite number of ways that I could possibly do that, and the way someone else might approach that. It and these infinities, there are larger infinities than other infinities, according to mathematics. But
Yes.
all of these all of these things are where the human potential can lie. And I you know, maybe at some point in decades or centuries from now, you'll have artificial intelligence that can write more than Dorgal. But I'm a believer that you have to live and experience. You know, I'm in terms of artificial intelligence. I think embodiment is key. But that doesn't necessarily mean embodiment by a robot, because there'll always be alien. I can't, for example, put myself 100% in your shoes. Yes,
Yes.
if you're a heterosexual male and you've had a number of girlfriends that one of them cheated on you, another one stole your money or whatnot, I can
Yeah.
understand that,
Yeah.
and can understand certain aspects of it. But I'm gonna not know the particulars. But I don't have to know the
Yeah.
particulars. As an artist, I'm not writing to reach every person's inner soul or whatnot. Someone may find, you know, if I look, I was comparing the character of Billy Pilgrim with a character in this
Holden Caulfield?
no, Bruce Arrow, the guy I mentioned, has only one great novel he wrote with character John Argent. I said he and Billy Pilgrim are two very similar characters, but you don't. I don't have to touch every aspect of every human being's soul. If you find one of my works or one of my poems to be comically funny and that satisfies you, that's good. And if someone else finds something else, and you both think, well, this is a great poem, but for different reasons, I'm kosher with that. Now, if there's a poem or something written by me or John Donne or Walt Whitman that I think is obviously great, and I think I could prove it, and you say, oh, it's a piece of shit, well, then we can argue about that.
Yeah.
But again, it art is about communicating. I'm gonna by virtue of whatever I'm writing about say something about myself, something about my time, and who knows what's going to happen in the future, because is the English language going to be around in 10,000 years? Nuclear waste, one of the biggest
Right.
problems they have with nuclear waste is not just containing the nuclear waste,
That's
but
how to
making
tell them.
signs, making
Yeah.
signs for the future and languages that aren't existent that says, beep, beep, beep.
Terrible things are here.
Yeah.
They're going to go to them, so they ended up semiotically deciding to not put any sign. But yes,
Yeah.
I understand. So I had one final question for you.
Okay.
You somewhat answered it with your subway metaphor. There's a word called conation. There's cognition, which is when you intellectually understand something. There's expression when you express your emotion. Conation is the intellectual ability to use your intellect to achieve a goal. So the goal, I want to write a play about Catherine the Great. How do I use my intellect to go about achieving these goals? And I think you answered it with the subway metaphor, is because there's an infinite possibilities of doing this, it comes down to experience. So it can't necessarily be taught, but it can be felt to a certain degree.
And if
Or
I
understood.
if I had wanted to do a Catherine the Great play 7 years ago when I started writing plays, and this will be play number 104 that I'm writing. If I was to do that, it would be a different play.
Yes,
Because I'm
but it would
better.
still be successful in your eyes.
Yeah, I mean, but it would probably be a lesser success, because when I look back at those first 27 plays, I'll put those 27 plays against 27 plays anyone ever wrote, including Shakespeare. I'll tell you they're better. But if I look at the last 27 plays I've written, they're several levels up. And I'm
Interesting.
better.
Interesting.
But I'm
But
better.
you do appreciate that, like, it was successful in the time, and then once you learn more things, then I see.
Yeah, and that's just normal. If
That's
you have
life,
the ability, and if you're dedicated to do it. If say if I live to 100 and at age 87 I'm just totally burned out, and I spend the last 13 years just doing
Making
hard of hearing, doing
shoes.
stuff like this with you, trying to
Yeah.
explain art or whatnot, I'll be satisfied with that. But
Yeah.
I'll also know that everything I ever wanted to write, if I for example could have gotten a grant and been a writer, I could produce at least 50% to maybe 150% more than I produced. Those things are gone, though. I can't do that.
Right.
So I'm not going to worry about that I could have written, instead of like 1,000 great poems, I could have written 1,600 or 2,000 if I never get back to poetry. That's just life.
That's
But
life.
do the best you can, and understand yourself. Understand
Your pros
when
and
you
cons.
need to push, and when pushing will be futile. Very few people have that ability, even outside of the arts or outside of thing. And so, again, I'm just talking in circles. But it was good talking with you. And if you ever want to do it again, just let me know.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think you're busier than I am, so whenever you're free, maybe we'll do it again next.
Yeah.
I don't know, after some holiday.
Yeah,
All right.
sure.
Much appreciated. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Apologize to your wife for me. I'm sure I took up too much of your time.
It was nice meeting and talking with you. So,
Thank you very much.
and if you ever need help or want me to look at that detective novel, let me know.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Take care.